I crocheted these kitchen scrubbies using this special scrubby yarn using free online patterns. I wanted to show you the items that I made, review the patterns, and show you some tips and tricks I learned along the way, along with sharing some caveats or warnings that I think you should be aware of before embarking on a project like this. You might have seen me use this before. This was actually the second time I brought out these yarns. The first time I had made a granny square. Well, I had actually made I didn't make two granny squares. I tried with one granny square. It failed. It was supposed to be a sheep. Didn't work. My second attempt was making a llama with this green and the white one and a lot of these colors. It was much more of a success. And I actually still use it in the kitchen. It's a little grimy. I didn't need to show it, but just trust that we still have it and I still use it. So then I came to the realization that there are actual scrubby patterns that I could take advantage of. So I wanted to go over that today. I'll show you everything and then we'll go in order about each of the items. This is a ducky that I made. This was the first one that I made. I knew that when I saw the pattern, this yellow yarn was calling out for that pattern. So I had to make that one for sure. This is an orange slice, and this could be any color. If you wanted to make it green, it would be a lime, a yellow would be a lemon slice. So you could, there are more possibilities in this one, but this is an orange slice. This one is a star. And I have this sort of unique looking one. It's webbed and it has the ability to roll up for a different use of cleaning as well as storage. And then I have this black cat scrubby. We'll go in order of how I made them. The first one I mentioned I made was this rubber ducky. This one was actually pretty fun to make. I omitted the eye that was in this pattern because I learned from when I was making the llama that I didn't have a very good experience weaving or sewing rather, using a needle to actually sew. This yarn is very stiff and it's also translucent. The way that the yarn is composed, you can kind of see through it. It's really hard, for me at least, to weave ends in. It's really hard for me to sew using this yarn. So I decided not to do that. And I didn't think I really lost anything. You can definitely tell it's a ducky. So I opted not to do the eye and I think it's still fine. It's really cute and it's a really good size. When I did the llama granny square, I knew that it was hard to see where the stitches were. So if you're doing things like counting stitches or really trying to see, like for example, when you finish up this side, this curve around the duck's butt is supposed to be smoother. I have more of an angle. I think I decreased this row too quickly. It's honestly because I couldn't see and I couldn't count. So I tried to save it when I did the single crochets around the perimeter. That's one of the last steps. You do the single crochets around the whole perimeter of the duck. So I saved it a little bit, but there's still a bit of an angle. So just something to be aware of. And the last thing I wanted to mention about this is when I sewed on the beak. You can see that when the orange piece and the yellow piece are created as two separate pieces and then you sew it in. I had mentioned earlier I was gonna have a hard time with sewing, so it wasn't terrible. It was probably across just like 4 stitches, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but still weaving in ends, not really sure how to do that. It's not the same as if you would probably do if you were using like acrylic yarn or any other standard yarn. So it sticks out a little bit. I think that one of the things I learned or that I would like to pass on while using this type of yarn is that you have to be okay with it. Maybe like you just have to set your expectation that it's not going to be the exact same as using a cotton yarn or an acrylic yarn. But overall, I highly recommend this pattern. It's a really easy pattern to follow, so I think you'll be really satisfied with the result as well. The next item I crocheted is this kitty scrubby. It was actually made for cotton yarn, and one of the things that I wanted to do was to test if I could use a scrubby pattern and use a scrubby yarn, even if it called for a cotton yarn, because this is meant for like your face. I would not use this on my face. This would be way too harsh. I wanted to have a black cat scrubby with a strap on it. So that was the idea behind this pattern. I don't want this product to be representative of the pattern completely because the pattern did call for cotton yarn and I chose to use this scrubby yarn in graphite. I am not totally sure if I executed all this correctly. The clusters, so these pieces here, the thick pieces here, are made using cluster steps. I don't know if I did it correctly. I kind of wish in the pattern that clusters were explained in more detail, or that's just something in the crochet world that I'm lacking knowledge of. So I'm not totally sure if I did that all correctly. The other thing is with other yarns, for example, a cotton yarn like this was supposed to be made in, the yarn is a lot more stretchy and flexible. This is, I keep mentioning that this yarn is very stiff. So when you have these clusters in the pattern, you'll see that the clusters are a lot more closed. This execution is a lot more holy. I don't feel that the cat came through in this pattern. I don't see a cat, unfortunately. So I would say for this pattern, definitely to stick with a more standard yarn. I just don't feel like the cat really comes through in this yarn. I love the strap. It's crooked. We're not going to comment on it. It's too far down. I think I definitely miscalculated or misaligned here. I should have done it one up, but you get the idea. But I think this would make a really cute face scrubby using cotton yarn, but let's stick with that and not use this scrubby yarn for this specific pattern. The next item I made was this star washcloth. This one also called for a cotton yarn, but I feel like the execution of it wasn't as challenging, and I feel like the pattern on this yarn definitely translated more successfully than the kitty. It was at this point that my hand started hurting. I was definitely cramping. One of the other things I want to note about this yarn is that it's a lot harder to work with. And yes, I keep mentioning how hard it is to see the stitches, how hard it is to weave ends through, but I'm just saying also it's harder to actually physically work with this yarn because of how stiff it is. So you have to work harder to get the stitches through and to make your product. The other thing that slows you down is that this yarn gets twisted, which creates two problems. One is it gets bunched up in your hand. So when you have your yarn and you are, wrapping it for tension and everything, I often got it so that it would like clump in my hand, and then I'd have to pause to unclump it. The other thing is that over time, the yarn would get twisted, so I'd have to keep pausing and untwisting the yarn, otherwise it would clump in my hand and I would just have to keep straightening it out. And in addition to that, you're gonna have to take more breaks than you think because of how much harder you have to work with this yarn. I really liked this pattern because it was repetitive, so I didn't have to keep referring back to the pattern itself. I can just keep going. I might change a couple of things. I would do a magic circle. The beginning of this pattern calls for a chain. So you do a foundation chain and then you loop through the initial chain with a slip stitch. And then you have this tail that you work your crochets in, and then you can pull it in order to close this circle. So something that I would do differently is I would actually just make a magic circle. And the other thing is that I would make this a lot small. I mean, this is it asked for a 10-inch tail, and I made it exactly 10 inches. I used a ruler and measured it 10 inches. It doesn't need to be that long. I realized later the length was so you can pull the circle taut. It could be like this long and I'd be fine with it. I don't think you need that much yarn. So a couple of very, very, very slight modifications I would make with this pattern, but I mean, the star is super cute. If it was made with a more traditional yarn, I think these holes would be closed up a little bit more because of the flexibility and the shrinkability of the yarn on when you're using it, but I think that this one is a success and I would recommend this pattern as well. If you're, just a heads up, you will have to learn how to do a front post and back post double crochets. That's how these ridges are created. I didn't know how to weave in some ends. I think I'll just have to cut this and then hope it doesn't come apart. Although I don't really feel like there would be any consequence of this coming loose, so I feel like I can just cut it. But otherwise, you have to just knot it and pray, I guess. But I recommend this pattern for making a star scrubby. The next item I want to talk about is this weave pattern for this scrubby. You can see I'm unrolling it. It was nighttime at this point and I was a little over it. I'm not gonna lie. So you start with a long foundation chain And then, problem, you have to count your chains in order to space these initial sort of anchors in, and I miscounted, but I didn't care. I kept going, and you can't tell, right? Like, you can't tell which one is the one where I miscounted the gap. So one of these gaps is bigger than the others. You cannot tell at all. And then after that, you continue to make chains, and then you latch the chain onto the previous chain, the previous gap, and then you make more chains, and then you single crochet onto the next gap, make another chain, and then latch that one onto via a single crochet. And you keep going around and around and around and around for seemingly forever. This is probably half the length that was meant in the pattern. Like I mentioned, was very over it, and I quit early. I feel like you get the point though. If this was the only one I made and I hadn't made the previous 3 and my hand was not hurting, I'm sure that I would have gone the full length and made it the 11.5 inches, but I just couldn't. So maybe that's part of the beauty of this too. You can make it customizable to yourself as much as you wanted. So I chose to go this length. The way that it rolls up is, there's actually a video that will help you on here. And you roll it up like this, and you can use the Scrubby like this as well, or you can use it this way for storage. They both work. The customization of it actually reminded me, for this star, another thing I liked about this pattern is that you can make it customizable to the size that you want. You could keep going to make the star bigger, or you can stop early to make the star smaller if you want to. So I just did what the recommended size was for the star, and it became out about this size, maybe about bigger than the size of my palm. This pattern, it's easy, it's repetitive. I was trying to get in a groove and keep going, but I was very annoyed at how much this yarn kept twisting and how much I needed to untwist it. I got to the point where I was like starting to pre-twist it myself. Like, I would overcorrect and twist it in that direction so that I could buy twice as much time, you know? So that was one of the things I came across when making this one. But otherwise, easy pattern. I think a really unique looking Scrubby, and I would recommend it. This next one that I want to show you is this orange slice. Fruit slice. It is comically large. I should have stopped sooner, especially with how much my hand was hurting. I definitely should have stopped sooner, but it is a good pattern to make. I'll just open up with that. I would recommend this. One of the things, I experienced it with the star too. I would keep chafing my hand, and my hands are still a little bit sore in working with this yarn. Again, it's very stiff. So when you're working with it, you would just get to certain points where your other hand would kind of chafe on the existing product. Whereas with a traditional yarn, you can just roll up the yarn, or you can roll up the product in your hand and it wouldn't be an issue. But that is something I faced making this. I might not have faced it if I just stopped sooner, but that's what I decided to do. I feel like you can also do this. You can also probably fold it and make kind of a half wedge like that. And then, you know, do this hook here. So that's like that. I would recommend this one. I think my favorite ones are probably this one and the duck. I would say the duck, the slice, and then the star. I really enjoyed making these halfway through, and then halfway through my hand was hurting. So I would recommend taking breaks. I would recommend setting your expectations. I thought I could actually make 7 of these. I had 2 more on the list that I didn't end up making. Set your expectations, maybe a little bit lower than what you could traditionally make with a cotton yarn or an acrylic yarn or a wool yarn. The process will be a little bit longer to use this yarn with. I would also recommend sticking with actual Scrubby patterns and not doing what I did the first time, which was trying to use just like any old pattern and crocheting something out of it using this. If you have a favorite crochet Scrubby pattern, or actually, do people knit with this? Anything else I can do to make it? Because clearly I have a lot more and I'm interested in making more. Please let me know. I've linked all the patterns down below, and let me know what you think. Stay tuned for my next video. Talk to you soon. Bye.